One of the things I enjoy most about YouTube is answering your questions. Your questions range from how does power reserve work to what's the future of Audemars and which watch brand makes the best watches. This time too, there are a ton of questions that you, the viewers, have submitted. This is my 150,000 subscriber celebration Q&A video. Let's dive in. If this is your first Q&A with me, there are some things you need to know. I don't prep my answers for these Q&As. I try to make them as off the cuff as possible. That does mean that I might get a fact wrong or a detail slightly off because I haven't done my usual fact checking process. 2, stream of consciousness. So it means what I'm thinking right now, I have the right to change my opinion tomorrow. 3, these videos have a lot of questions, so the individual questions are listed in the description below. Watch some of the video now and come back for the rest later. Also, I don't do a lot of B-roll on these videos. I like to keep it simple. And finally, thank you for all the support. You have no idea how appreciated it actually is to me. So thanks a ton. And with that, not the first question, but a wristwatch check. And why the wristwatch check? Well, because I am hopefully being featured in Teddy Baldasar's The Watch I Wore the Most video. And I don't want that to be the place where I make this reveal. Why not? Because you are my core customers and my core viewers, so you should see it first. And it's a watch that is the one that I bought when you look at the counter of I almost hit 200 watches or 200 days since last purchase. It's Rolex Daytona 126-500 with a black dial. This is a watch I bought this year, obviously. I have come around. I know there are Rolex haters and lovers. It's a watch I've been thinking about for a long time. I once turned down a Rolex almost 25 years ago because I didn't think it was interesting, and I ended up buying a Breitling instead. But finally, I had a look at it and I thought it was amazing. I mentioned my interest to the AD, and a little bit under a year later, they gave me a call and said, "Are you still interested?" And they found out that I was, and I jumped at the chance. And in terms of where it is in my wear, obviously the most worn watch of the year, but even more importantly, this is the first time in 7 years that a Rolex tops the list of watches that I've worn the most. And as you guys that have been here several times, you know I have an Excel sheet. I know to the day what I've worn, when I've worn, and how much I've worn it. So 7 years, and Rolex is at the top of the list for the first time in 7 years. And now the questions. Got the questions here on my little trusty iPhone. How does power reserve work? That's a technical question. Inside the movement, you've got a thing called a barrel. Inside the barrel, or outside, it just looks like any other cogs or gears in the movement, but inside it has a coil, a spring. That coil is what gets wound up either by the crown or by an oscillating weight. The thing that defines the power reserve is essentially how big that coil is and how quickly it releases its power. So if you have a 4 Hertz movement versus a 2 Hertz movement using the same coil and mainspring and gear train, then the 2 Hertz movement is going to have a longer power reserve. If you want to go a step deeper, then there are a couple of considerations. If you want more power reserve and you don't want to lower the beat rate, you can either make a bigger barrel with a bigger coil. Oris has some models with huge barrels, IWC do as well, but this leads to bigger movements overall, and that leads to bigger watches. You can also add extra barrels that work in serial. That also needs more space, plus it adds a bit more complexity to the movement. 2, you can't just wind the coil however you want, because the other thing you're thinking about is the torque and the torque curve. And I'm sure you as a child, you've taken a tape measure or something and you wound it really tightly and then you let it go to see it release the energy. Well, depending on the material of the coil, the thickness, the width and the length, the tension and the windability of it and the stability of the torque curve will be affected. The torque curve is important for accuracy. What you don't want is a massive amount of torque release in the beginning and then a huge drop off. What you want is a release that is consistent over 80 to 90% of the coil's winding length, because that's what will give you the most consistency. Why is there so much hate for the Rolex brand? I did a whole video on the misunderstandings about the brand. I will link to it here. Short version, when you're the biggest game in town and you're also positioning yourself as exclusive and desirable, there are going to be massive haters. They are also, as a company, in it to make money, so some things they do really rubs people the wrong way. Personally, I don't get that worked up about it. They're a brand, they're trying to sell watches. For a mass-produced watch, they are really, really good. Nothing more, nothing less. Just make up your own mind and don't be a slave to other people's opinions. Do you make money from your channel? Yes, I do. I make ad revenue from YouTube. It's not a huge amount and it's not enough for me to consider quitting my day job. I haven't done anything else paid. I don't have the time and I just don't want to do anything watch related. I'd be fine with advertising for cooking utensils or something, or food supplements, but not anything watch related. It feels wrong to me. And at the end of the day, I also just don't have time. There's a lot of work in collaborating with those kind of brands. I also don't take watches as gifts. I don't keep watches for review. I don't get gifts from brands. So that's the way I like it. It gives me independence and freedom, and that's the way it is. Does knowing how many jewels are in a mechanical movement affect your decision to buy a watch? No, not at all. Jewels are there, among other things, for reducing friction. With a standard time-only manual wind movement, the number of jewels is usually relatively predictable. Generally speaking, the more complicated a movement, the more jewels they're going to be. So anywhere there's a moving part or something, they're going to have friction, they're going to put a jewel. And I think an IWC automatic perpetual calendar is going to have something like 55, 56, 57 jewels. A manual wind date and time only watch is going to have somewhere around 17, 18 jewels. And to me, this is like a car brand saying that their car has a 6-speed gearbox. If you've got a 4-cylinder combustion engine with 110 horsepower, you're likely going to have reverse and 4 forward gears. Now, if you're in the old manual days, you had a 385 horsepower V6 from Mercedes, you were going to have 6 or 7 gears, 1 reverse and 5 or 6 forward. It's not a sign of quality, it's a consequence of how the engine is constructed and what is needed to transfer the energy. The same principle in general applies for jewels. Do you ever get burnt out from the watch hobby? I have hot and cold periods like everybody. I've found that now that I have a lot more access to watches and do content every week, 2 things kind of happen. It's a luxury problem, but it's the way it is. I don't get as excited about all the new watches coming out. I see patterns, I see recognition, it gets a little bit monotonous, and some days it can jade me a little bit. I can even become a little bit blasé about new watches. I think it takes more to impress me than it did prior to the channel. So in part, I have higher standards because I spend so much time on it, but sometimes it just is also, it takes a lot to process. But then you have a watch like Breguet, the 7225, and I get really excited, and then everything is fine. The good thing also in terms of sort of the hot and cold periods, I've definitely slowed down in terms of spending money on watches, which is, all things being equal, a good thing. Taking a quick time out from the questions, if you are new to watches, new to watch collecting, and new to my channel, then you are maybe not subscribed. If so, click the subscribe button. Here I talk about watches and everything watch related. I love these little bundles of joy. I stay unbiased, I am honest, and I am not in anybody's pocket. Subscribe. Thanks a ton. Oi, long question. The IWC Ingenieur receives a lot of hate because the movement they use is available in the Baume & Mercier at a fraction of the cost, but I don't hear the same negativity towards Hublot using Sellita movements in some of their models. How would you compare and justify one or the other's value for money? Is the negativity towards IWC really justified? First of all, Hublot is criticized. Go to Nico Leonard, trust me, they charge you $8,000 for a watch with a Sellita movement inside. It's totally not okay, which is completely off. But for those of you that don't know, in some IWC models, that's the Ingenieur, the Mark 20, and maybe some others, they have a movement with 120 hours of power reserve. It's made in part together with Fleurier, and it's a base of a movement that's also found in Baume & Mercier. If you look at the 2 movements in the Baume & Mercier and in the Ingenieur, they are architecturally as close to being identical as I think you can get. I'm honestly not aware of anything in the movement that is meaningfully different, but it could be that there's a better spring or a different material or some, silicone something, but I'm leaning towards assuming that it's not the case. From there, there's discussion more about what justifies the price difference between an Ingenieur and a Baume & Mercier, and it's not just about the movement. I can tell the difference in build quality of 2 watches. I can tell on the case, I can tell on the bracelet. I know the case construction of the Ingenieur is hardest to do. The dials on the Ingenieur are also better and more intricate. Now, do all those things add up to, 3, 4x, 5x, the cost corresponding to the same level of higher MSRP? Most likely not. But I've said this, I think, a million times. Above a certain point, and for me, that certain point is around $3,000 to $4,000, mass-produced watches will have diminishing returns in terms of the relationship between cost, features, and the actual MSRP. An Omega Seamaster 300M costs, I think, $6,700, $7,000. A Submariner is $10,000. That's almost 50% more expensive. I do not believe the Submariner costs 50% more to produce. I just don't. So what am I paying for? Well, I'm always paying for design and development. I'm always paying for manufacturing of the movement. I'm always paying for manufacturing of externals, case, dial, and bracelet. I'm paying for handmaidedness, which you don't get much below $10,000, but it's there. And then you pay for identity. IWC is a more high status brand. That allows them to cost their watches at a higher price. The Ingenieur doesn't hold its value completely, but for an IWC, it doesn't fall off a cliff once you walk out of the door from an AD. That's because people really like that watch. Those two, the Riviera and the Ingenieur is better put together. It is a superior watch. I will argue to my death's door that is the case. I've had them both. I've handled them multiple times. I can tell the difference, and there is a higher cost that's going into that watch. But it's not 3 or 4x. You're also paying for IWC, and you're paying for everything that's related to that. Whether that's worth it to you or not, your choice. What is your favorite complication in a watch? Moon phase when done right. Chronographs also, but a really well done moon phase is good looking. It adds to the dial. It's uncluttered, but it still adds something. Power reserves, tourbillons are rarely good looking to me. Perpetual calendars are cool as a complication, but there's often far too much going on the dial. Is Oris worth over 2,000K when you can get a Sellita SW200 in a micro brand for around $800? There's so much complexity to such a seemingly simple question. I'm just going to list a couple of things. A Sellita SW200 is not just a Sellita SW200. There are different grades which have different implications on quality and materials and accuracy and aesthetics, and they have differing costs. The one at $800 is not the high grade SW200. Also, a dial is not just a dial. Even a sunray is not just a sunray. I can by now tell the difference between a cheap sunray dial, a mid-range sunray dial, and a high-end sunray dial. I looked at the Mosers recently. I had my son, we were walking through a store and looking at the Moser dials, and I don't know if they're technically sunrays, but the level of shine those things have is completely insane, where a cheap sunray, you can literally see not the striations, but the scratches in the actual disc. All those kind of things cost more. The $800 watch is also not getting regulated or quality tested in the same way as an Oris. When Oris and other brands design a watch, there's much more product testing and customization to their needs that leads to a more consistent product that raises the price. And I could go on. It's cases, it's bezels, it's crowns, it's plots, it's quality control. There are meaningful differences that lead to meaningful cost differences. There's this persistent myth that some $800 or $400 watches are just as good as $1,500 or $3,000 watches. They're just not. Are they very, very good? Yes. Is the gap, especially on things like machining of cases and bracelets, very, very small? Absolutely. But there are still meaningful differences. Give me a sub $1,000 Baltic and put it side by side with a $2,000 Oris, and I will be able to show you the differences. Some of them are subtle, but they are there. Whether it's worth it to you, that's a personal question. Are Blancpain as good as their price? I'll state it this way. Blancpain doesn't skimp. They don't throw in plastic movements to cut costs. They don't forego a bit of anglage to get the price point to match their costs. For a watch at that price compared to most other watch brands in that price range, they offer the same level of build in terms of case, dial, movement, finishing, decoration. That's both specs and it's all the bells and whistles you want from a watch at that price point. They don't hold their value at all. Somebody in the comments is bound to say that they are overpriced for what they are, and I'll say two things to that. First is what goes into a watch. The cheapest watches are assembled with little to no creative or development work going into them. These are brands that buy a case that looks nice, or they copy a design that looks nice. They buy a dial that looks nice. They buy a movement that does the job, and they slap it all together. That can lead to, almost accidentally good watches, but that's what you get. From there, more and more thought and development goes into the watch. At Longines or someone similar at $3,000-ish, they are going to be looking at the movement and making changes to it to live up to whatever standards they set for it. So if they want higher accuracy or longevity or power reserve or finishing or anti-magnetism, time and effort is going into that. Also, they don't just buy a bracelet. They've put thought into the design overall and how the case and the dial and the bracelet are cohesive in terms of aesthetic and position. There's also way more quality control. At $10,000, a Rolex Submariner, you're still getting a mass-produced product, but they're not skimping. Brands in this space are usually putting a lot of effort into making really good movements. They're spending money on developing new lubricants that last longer. And coming up with a movement is just infinitely more expensive to do than copying somebody else's movement. The dials are going to have details that cost money, like etched rehotes, applied white gold plots. The bracelet clasp has been tested in a machine that simulates 50 years of wear and tear. All that kind of stuff adds up. And above the Rolex point, you get brands like Blancpain that put effort into making interesting movements. You'll see double barrels and even triple barrels, and I think it's done to extend power reserve and get more accuracy. You'll see all sorts of niche details in terms of mechanics that make for a really impressive movement. The constructions are often more complex, and you'll see more stuff done sort of by hand, and not everything, but there will be more detailing. Blancpain is in that category, and they have a product in general that's on par. So in terms of what goes into a watch, Blancpain gives me what similarly priced brands at that point deliver. As for overpricing, do they charge a premium for the brand? Absolutely. The more expensive the watch is, the more likely the multiplier on cost is going to be higher. So being overpriced is ultimately a subjective experience and not an objective fact. The only thing you need to know is you don't need a watch. You are buying it for the experience. You assign whatever value you want to it. Hi, Mike. Thanks for fantastic content. Oh, thank you. That's so kind of you. Is a time-only automatic watch more accurate than a watch with multiple complications? All things being equal, then probably yes, but also no. And this is connected to that mainspring and barrel answer I gave a little bit before. And this is the ultra simplified version. You need torque, which is a form of power, to turn the gears. The characteristics of the mainspring barrel, the friction coefficient of the gear train and the balance wheel and the escapement are the chain where all that torque goes. When you add complications, assuming they are powered by the same barrel as the time function, you're going to add resistance, might be the wrong word, but I'm going to say resistance to the entire movement. If you add resistance to the entire movement, that means that if you don't increase the torque, you're going to get a lower amplitude. And if you get a lower amplitude, you're going to get a lower accuracy. And also fundamentally, if you don't have enough torque, you might not be able to turn everything efficiently. Think of it this way. You have a car with an engine with certain characteristics. It's got a certain performance. Now, add a trailer on the back. Most cars are going to perform differently when the trailer is on the hitch. The trailer is the complication. Some cars can't even pull a fully loaded trailer depending on the weight. Your acceleration is definitely going to be affected. Your handling is going to be affected. You need an engine that can be used for towing stuff. And the same goes for the movement. If you add a complication, you're going to lose amplitude and or power. So when building a movement with a complication, you need to take into account the power needs of the base movement and also the complication. Either that, or you decouple the complication when it's not in use. That's something you do in things like chronographs, or you also do something like Zenith have done in the Chronomaster Defies that have a separate barrel and a separate train for the chronograph, so one does not affect the other. So the answer is yes. The same movement, but a complication on top is likely going to be less accurate, but that's where the brands invest in developing a movement that could handle the extra complications. And when they do that, you should be able to achieve the same level of accuracy, more or less at least. Why doesn't Seiko regulate their movements better? My guess is it's a question of price points and differentiation. Seiko have watches that go from $500 to $4,000. $5,000 in the Seiko line. Above that, you've got King Seiko, and then you've got Grand Seiko. I think when you have a brand that spans such a broad range of prices and qualities, you need to differentiate the products quite distinctly. And I think one of the places you differentiate is by saying that for any sub $1,000 watch with a 6R35 movement, they have first of all, the movement is a lesser movement, but also they have a limited regulation and a lesser testing protocol that keeps the costs down. There's a fair discussion to be had whether the accuracy that some of these entry-level movements from Seiko is competitive these days, but I think that's the most plausible reason. And I think you should think of it this way. If Rolex was a brand that had a $7,000 Oyster Perpetual and a $1,000 Oyster Perpetual, which was the value offering. Would you buy the $7,000 version if the $1,000 version was every bit as good as the 7? I mean, you would be an idiot to do so. So obviously, if you had it under the same umbrella of Rolex, the $1,000 version would have to be worse. You are the CEO of IWC. The board has given you complete carte blanche to do anything you want. You can cut lines, you can redesign models, you can amend pricing, you can hire brand ambassadors, anything. What's the plan? I like IWC. I think right now that their CEO is doing a good job. And I have to state this, I don't think I could do a better job than him. I honestly don't. I'm just a nerd, but I am allowed to have an opinion. On top of that, I've actually met the guy. I've also met Christian Knoop and others on the team, and I've had good conversations with them about their business. So they've got a whole lot more considerations to take into account that I don't have to take into account. So even if I had an idea that in isolation was a good one, theirs would also be to see that idea or solution in the context of all the other stuff they're trying to achieve. And with that said, my thoughts. I don't think the Aquatimer is particularly competitive. I know from my conversation with them that it's performing to their expectations, but for me, I feel like it's too niche of a product. I would love to phase in a new version of the old GST models. I think they are superior, they're better looking, and they have far more potential. Now, Christian Knoop made a good point about how the GST would be hard to put back in the lineup when you've already got the Ingenieur, the Pilot, the Portuguese, and the Aquatimer. It would create an overlap on the other models, essentially a model that leeches off customers from the other models. And he's right, it would. But for me, the problem is I'd see the GST coming back as a dive-focused lineup, replacing the Aquatimer and then phasing the Aquatimer out in its current form. But that, and it's a fair point from them, it would result in a hole that the GST wouldn't fill immediately. And that's a shift in direction that's really hard. That is like what AP did with the 1159. They killed all other lines, so the millenaries and everything. And then they said, we only have the Royal Oak, and then they put in the 1159. Now, maybe the millenaries were selling so little, it was like, it's so easy to kill them because nobody was buying them. And they said, there's no risk to killing the lineup and throwing in. But if the Aquatimer is selling a certain number of watches that is acceptable and meaningful to IWC, pulling that one completely out of the lineup and then throwing in something new that is not going to from day one sell the same amount, that's a risky proposition. But from a pure lineup perspective, I would think that over time, the GST would outperform the Aquatimer. Then they've got the Pilot Performance Chronos. To me, they were launched to be the competitive alternative to the Rolex Daytona and the Speedmasters of the world and the Chronomaster Sports of the world from Zenith. The price is almost exactly halfway between a Speedy and a Daytona, with the difference being that the IWC in the entry model is in titanium, which usually commands a premium. I would still look for a steel version, and I would price it closer to a Speedy. I don't personally like the bracelet. It's great for the Ingenieur, but not here. I would also think that it needs more variants, so pandas, reverse pandas, maybe even a blue dial. But the problem with my suggestion here is that if you put it in steel, then it starts to be priced at the level of the Pilot's Chronos, and they would cannibalize off of each other, which is not what you want. Back to the GST Aquatimer discussion. Here, it's exactly, to me, what is happening with the GST and why they're not doing the GST. The Pilot Performance feels like it's in this no man's land where it's not priced to be really competitive because then it would hurt the Pilot sales, but it's not positioned competitively against the likes of the Daytona. So I'm kind of unclear on what the purpose of it is. I'm sure they sold a few after the Formula One collab, but it feels very niche and it doesn't feel completely fleshed out as a lineup. It feels like an appendage. Then there's the Portofino, and this was also a question I asked them, and the answer was, considering that we don't advertise at all, we sell a lot of them. He stated an actual number on the watches, but I don't think I'm allowed to share that. But basically my question was if the Portofino and the Portuguesa were overlapping. They feel they aren't, and the Portofino does well with very little effort on their part. I do, though, think they are still relatively closely positioned, and I'd be interested in pushing the Portofino more actively towards women with at least building in some more options. There are dial variants, there are jeweled models, smaller versions, but it's not as strongly positioned as I think it could be. and it could be a stronger alternative to people who otherwise would consider a Panther from Cartier. I'd also be curious to understand what kind of buyers buy their pilots' watches. I mean, what's the split between enthusiasts and regular semi-wealthy people? What makes these customers buy the pilots and not a Speedy? I'm not actually one of the people that has a problem with the fact that they have movements from Fleurier that are also in the Baumann Mercier models, but it does bother me that an engineering forward watchmaker isn't actively advertising anti-magnetic properties and incredibly high accuracy. They don't have COSC, to my knowledge, in any models. They are incredibly strong on engineering in general, but you wouldn't know it if you were outside of the enthusiast bubble, especially since value is such a big thing. I do think specifically IWC would benefit from talking more about that. They could pivot a little bit more to the value of their offerings, sort of like what Breitling is doing. Then there's their website and their social media in general. Again, I spoke to them about this. They spoke about how their watches are emotional objects, how people connect with watches, and how mechanical watches have a whole other personal resonance compared to smartwatches. But you know what I almost consistently can't find on their website? People or emotion. There's not one product where I can find a picture of a watch on the wrist of somebody. It's always the product on its own, which is what they're showcasing is the product and letting the product speak for itself. That's got all sorts of strengths. It shows a confidence in the product. It emphasizes the engineering nature of IWC. But I also think it's completely devoid of any form of emotional resonance. I, to this day, think one of the best advertising campaigns within watches are the old Rolex ads where, if you were in this room, you'd be wearing a Rolex. And also the Patek ads of you never really own a Patek. Why? Because they had an emotional resonance. They gave you an emotional hook you could latch onto. Why would you just buy a pilot's watch? It's the same mechanism for why you don't see ads for just cars. You see them on open roads where there's no traffic, driving through stunning scenery and crossing mountain terrain. And you see the family so happy camping out in the wild. You're driving a vehicle. There's never any other cars. They're about freedom and independence and exploration. The term pilot's watch communicates nothing other than watch for pilots. That's why the F1 movie was good for them. It's not just because it was a movie. It's not just because it was Brad Pitt. It's not just because it was Formula One. It's because they managed to affix an emotional hook to the product. I want to see more of that. Then there's the last thing that bugs me, and this is not just IWC. A lot of watch brands do this. If you go to Ferrari, their website, and you pick a car, you're going to notice two things. One, there are not a lot of cars to choose from. Two, you can always configure your car. If you go to Bentley, it's the same story. There are not a ton of options, and you can make your own bespoke Bentley. If I go to IWC and I click on Ingenieur, I get a list, a long list. Where's the feeling of curation and exclusivity that a product that starts at $6,000 and the Ingenieur is $12,000 should convey? Make each watch feel special. I mean, even In-N-Out Burger do this better. They have 3 burgers. They've got the hamburger, the cheeseburger, and the double. On top of that, they've got the not so secret menu. It's a curated menu. It feels special. If you click enough times on Rolex, you will get to the long list. But the starting point for Rolex is always simple. It's one watch, a little button that says configure. They do everything they can to guide you towards the configurator, which makes each watch seem more special and bespoke than it really is. It's a little bit of that I'm looking for. Maybe they have to have categorizations like the classic and the custom. So in classic, you have the plain IWC Mark 20 and the Petit Prince. And in the custom, you have the ceramic models and the Ceratanium models and all that kind of stuff. Help people curate their watch experience. More than anything, though, emotional resonance. That's what I'm looking for. Those are my thoughts. What are the ups and downs of being a one-brand collector? I haven't got a clue. I'm not a one-brand collector. I understand the appeal. I only own Apple products. I don't have Android devices. I've got a preference for Apple, and I know I'm locked into their ecosystem. And I suppose it's the same for somebody that only has Rolex or Longines. When it comes to watches and collecting, I think I would feel I was missing out by just sticking with one brand. It's like always going to the same restaurant every year for your birthday. I would prefer variety over that, but some people would prefer the predictability and the comfort of choosing what you know and like. It's a personal choice. Fellow ex-Safa. How's it, bro? Love your channel. I love all things mechanical in nature, engineer by trade. I was always amazed by the creative marketing around diamonds, the entire physiological approach and the adaptability to changes in times. blah, 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 blah. Sorry, I'm just going to skip some of this. Okay. Rolex, quality but boring. Having looked at some $1,000 watches, they are brilliant. Do you think these micro brands, Chinese brands, will put a debt into Swiss when we realize it's more marketing and prestige than actual value we are buying? People will one day realize diamonds are a waste of time. Okay, so it's not just about diamonds, it's also about sort of Chinese and choosing Chinese. Watches are not practical products. Watches are always jewelry, and they are emotional products. Even for those people that say, I just want a high-spec watch for the lowest possible price, and if that's Chinese, then I'm buying the Chinese watch. That's not rational either. It's also emotional. You've got a clear emotion, and for you, price and quality evokes that emotion. You are buying based not on the specs of the product, but based on your values and how those values resonate in that product, be that St. Martin, Benrus, or Eddie's Dive. You like to believe that you're not a slave to marketing, but you are. There is emotion to sticking it to the man. There is emotion to getting a good deal. There is emotion in feeling that you are making a more intelligent decision by buying the replica compared to someone that pays full price for the real thing. All those things have nothing to do with the objective specs of the watch and have everything to do about how that purchase makes you feel inside. Buying that replica or buying that factory brand makes you feel good inside. Now, if I'm looking to lose weight and I have the option of getting semaglutide at, I don't know how much it costs, $2,000 per dose from Novo Nordisk, or I can get it from a no-name FDA certified brand for $500 per dose, here emotion shouldn't play a part. I'm going to get the $500 stuff. But jewelry? There are a lot of people that are willing to pay for the original and for the knowledge that they are wearing the original and everything that the original stands for. And as long as the original is good and can do that, then they're going to be fine. As Chinese brands start to establish their own brand identities, then yes, they will compete, but that takes time, and it won't just be down to who has the cheapest watch. Also, China, Southeast Asia, India won't always be competitive in terms of prices. Salaries are going up. Energy costs are going up. Material costs are going up. Over the long term, the whole idea of sending something somewhere else to make it get it made cheaper is going to erode. What do you think of Ulysse Nardin? I think the freak watches are super cool. The Air Diver, which I've had on the wrist, is also really impressive. It's not my favorite. The freak watches are the ones. The whole see my skin through the dial is a little bit weird. You get used to it, but it's fine. But the freaks are really, really cool. They have, over the years, tried to demonstrate some serious movement skill, and their new trajectory is really, really good. They're not quite mainstream yet, but they seem to have a positioning that's in a space of their own for now. What do you think of Bulgari watches? Bulgari is weird. They're a jewelry brand. They are also, like Cartier, one of the few brands that has a stronger appeal to women. The Serpenti models are very sort of Devil Wears Prada to me. They are locked in this infinite thinness competition with Piaget and sometimes Richard Mille, and that is something that for the most part impresses me. I think I heard and read somewhere that Concepto both deliver parts and sort of design contributions to both Piaget and Bulgari, so that kind of takes a little bit of the shine off. But I've owned a Bulgari Octo Finissimo, which is a fabulous watch. Wears incredibly well, bar one fact, it's very sharp case. You can actually feel it dig into your sort of sides every now and again, which is not ideal, but the thinness is absolutely amazing. But then you've got the Octo, which I think is just, it's not a particularly interesting watch. And then you've got the Bulgari, which feels like a Gucci. It's just feels so much like a fashion watch, and it doesn't appeal to me at all. So every now and again I pay attention, but for the most part I don't feel they have a lineup that, warrants me consistently going back and checking what they've got. If they release something, I'll take a look, and that's about it. Is it okay that I'm an accumulator and not a serious watch collector? I like them all and have a unique collection of watches, not a curated group. There are so many snobs in the watch world. There are so many people that want to make rules, and all they're doing is making those rules to gatekeep and feel better about themselves. So they will test you on your movement knowledge, and if you fail, you're not a real collector. I'm sure there's somebody that heard my explanation of something about movements earlier, and they're like, he doesn't know what he's talking about. He's not a real watch enthusiast. They will test you on the history of the Speedmaster and which one came first and what year and what date, and they will fail you if you don't answer correctly. Buy too many watches too quickly, and you're also not a collector. Don't have enough watches. Also not a collector. Buy a Rolex Daytona. Also not a collector. Buy what you like. Enjoy the watches the way you like. Or as George Carlin, my favorite comedian of all time, once said, other people's stuff is shit. My shit, though, is stuff. Coming from a family with a fair few Springbok supporters, what are your top 5 green and gold watches, either current or no longer in production? There's only one, Vacheron Constantin Overseas Green Dial. By far, that's the one. It's just stunning. What do you think of the Moser Pioneer line? I have handled several. They are stunners in terms of movements. I understand why people like them. I do, unfortunately, not always like what Moser does with their dials. And it's not that they're not good. I think just that they're sort of gradated, not sunray, but it's like they are impeccably done, but they're just too shiny for me. The exception might be the Flying Hours model, which I think is super cool. That one has enough for me to keep coming back to it. But the others, there are other models in the Moser lineup that I prefer. The Rolex Explorer two-tone, is it blasphemous or just user preference? It's user preference. Watches are jewelry. The reason people have a meltdown over the Explorer is because it's always been the last watch in the lineup that stayed more or less true to its tool roots. The two-tone Explorer just cemented what a lot of people probably already felt, which was that Rolex was no longer a maker of tool watches. They were makers of luxury jewelry. On a side note, though, I don't know who the heck the two-tone Explorer serves. It also trades most of the time under retail, which is not common for Rolex. I mean, just get a two-tone J-Just with a non-fluted bezel. It's doing the exact same thing. It just feels redundant with the two-tone Explorer. What is your own experience keeping the interval or sending a watch in only when it's mechanically necessary? I've got a lot of watches and I have my Excel sheet where I keep track of my usage. If I had only one watch, I'd likely wear it 250, 300 days a year. If I have 10 watches, then I'm wearing them 30 days per year on average. That just reduces wear and tear massively. So what I do is when the service interval comes up, I wear the watch for a couple of days and I track the accuracy. I might take it to an AD and have them throw it on a time graph and ask them to open it up. And if it's fine, you know, they tell me that, then I don't service it. So generally I don't automatically send it to service. Where are you from? South Africa, born and raised, also lived in Mauritius for some years. I've also lived in the US, and for the longest time, I've actually lived in Denmark, where I live now. Do you have an everyday carry? What's in it? I don't have a big everyday carry. I have my phone, I have my watch, and I have a Ridge wallet. I like the minimalist thing. I have knives all around. I've got torches, or what the hell you call it? Torches. Flashlights, that's what they call them, in the house and in the car and stuff like that. But on my body, watch, phone, Ridge wallet. If a Casio F91 was made out of diamond, would you wear it? God, no. I don't like diamond encrusted anything. I think most watches, and it doesn't matter if it's a Rolex Daytona or a off-market secondary Hublot thingamabob or an F91, no, it's not me. Do you ever see a return to the days when most people had wristwatches? No. Yes, no. 2 points. I don't think watches are like horse-drawn carts that are got replaced by cars. There is a utility to watches that mimics the utility of the horse-drawn cart and how the cart was replaced by the car. Part of what a watch does from a utility perspective is replaced by the phone or a Apple Watch. But where watches differ is they have managed to transition from a primarily utility-focused product to a fashion and aspirational product. These days, watches are an accessory. They are jewelry. A dress watch is jewelry. A sports watch is jewelry. A dive watch is just jewelry for men who don't want to be called out for wearing jewelry. And to that one guy who's actually a saturation diver, cool, you use it as a tool, but 99.8% of the world has dive watches that will never ever go diving, let alone swimming. They are jewelry. So, like any jewelry, it's not going away and it's going to be subject to trends and cycles. I think volumes are globally not going to go massively up. As people get richer, there will be more people that want watches, but overall, the sort of market, it's more and more niche as a jewelry thing. In 20 years, I'd assume that the volumes are the same or less for watches in total being sold, but they're still being sold. And there will be times when it's cool for young people or certain sectors to wear them. And then they will return to the good old days for periods of time where everyone's wearing watches, like Patagonia puffer vests have been a thing for many years. Wristwatches will become that as well for periods. Have you considered watchmaking as a career? God, no. I considered engineering when I was choosing a path for myself after sort of my secondary education, but honestly, I would have probably ended up in mathematics or software development. I might have ended up in construction engineering, so bridges or something like that, but never mechanical engineering, and definitely not something as intricate and creative as watches. My brain isn't geared towards details. My brain functions best on concepts and ideas and analysis. I would be an absolute terrible watchmaker. So I ended up with a generic business and finance degree, and the world is better off for it, and the watch world is better off for it. Watchmaking is something I will leave to somebody that has actual skill and talent and creativity, and that's just not me. Thoughts on Longines seemingly moving upmarket? They're not moving upmarket. Swatch Group have all their brands locked into different tiers. So Breguet is the top, below them are Glasuita and Blancpain, below that Omega, and below Omega Longines, and below Longines is Tissot. Longines under Swatch Group are never going to move up to where Omega are. They are always going to be Swatch Group's flagship value brand. And you can say a lot about Mr. Hayek, but he has always been quite committed to having watches accessible to people in all sort of price points. But they have been really improving their products, and I think they're trying to be more seriously considered than Tudor. And I know Longines sells a lot more watches than Tudor, but Tudor have had the mantle of value leader for some years now, and they have overall been a little bit more expensive and a little bit better than Longines. They've had Meta certification, their bracelets for quite a while were better, but Longines are actively closing the gap, if not have closed the gap on a lot of models. Prices have creeped up at the same time, not a lot, but some, but they're not at Tudor levels, and I don't see them going to Tudor levels. I see them staying a little bit lower. On top of that, they're seemingly not afraid to at least try to push the limits a little bit of what people are willing to pay for Longines. The Ultrachron, I think, goes for $5,000 for a 5 hertz ultra precise movement, which is reasonable for what you get, but it's more than you'd usually think to pay for a Longines. The same goes for Magitech in titanium, also around $4,500, $5,000. I think it's not a bad price, but it's on the high end of what people associate with Longines. I think they're trying to have some of those kind of products in their lineup, and I think they're there to entice a more premium buyer and also get people to move their perception of what a reasonable price is for a good value Longines watch. They're excellent value. I'd argue, and I've done this a video about, they are the value leader at the moment. So their prices are creeping up, but not because they're trying to move to a point, because they've upgraded and things cost more. Everything's going to get 3% more expensive on average, or 4 or 5. Things just get more expensive, but they haven't really moved their position as such. Which perpetual calendars would you recommend? Which ones give you a lot of bang for your buck? If you want bang for your buck, Frederic Constant gets you very, very far. IWC, JLC have good perpetual calendars, and I'm pretty sure they still both make versions that you get in steel cases. The ultra thin from JLC and the big pilots, possibly also a Portuguese or two, I'm not sure about the Portuguese, are available in steel. Just the fact that you're not paying the precious metal premium gives you access to the complication in a way that Patek, Vacheron, Lange, and all the others just don't. The high-end brands have that complication almost exclusively behind the precious metal paywall. If I had all the cash in the world and I also wanted to pay, the extra 20,000 for the gold model, you can get a Patek 5240, really, really cool. And probably my favorite, the Royal Oak Perpetual Calendar. Massive, that's a massively good watch. Not watch related. What are your favorite denims? Okay, I'll answer. If you don't watch Michael Christie's channel, The Iron Snail, then you should. He's a million times better YouTuber than me, and he was a loss for watch YouTube when he left Theo and Harris. But he has a clothing channel that I watch religiously. And it's a shameless plug. I'm not being paid. I just really, really like his channel. And he talks about denim. That's why I'm mentioning it. I like Ironheart. I like Momotaro. I like Samurai jeans. Samurai jeans are a little bit rough on the skin initially, and they fade a little bit fast to my taste. My favorites are Ironheart. I just like the durability and the weight of them. And if you are wearing anything under 21 ounces, you are not getting through the door of my house. 21, 23, 25, that's the way to go. Bonus points if you can make the person hemming your pants cry because just of the thickness of the material. What brand has the most interest to you from a historical perspective? Breguet. There are so many technical innovations that can be traced back to Breguet. It's not just good watches that were sold to rich people with wigs, which some other brands were. Breguet just has that technical edge in terms of so many things they've done. And it's part of their storytelling that I really, really appreciate. What do you think of Hublot these days? In-house movements, new materials, high horology, etc. Hublot get a bad rep. They are the quintessential brand. They were one of the brands that really got known for just making expensive watches or pricing them expensively and then sort of marketing them to footballers. They also have the classic fusions that have Celita movements inside for $8,000, which is absolutely ridiculous. But having said that, they are also a brand that do some interesting things. I don't think necessarily they pioneered sapphire cases, but they were definitely involved in popularizing them, and that's worthy of praise. They also do put work into coming up with interesting movements. They are still, though, one of the brands where you by far are paying more for the marketing in the brand than you are for the actual watches. The designs themselves don't speak to me that much. I'm not big on the Unicos and the Big Bangs and that kind of stuff, so that's a personal thing. You shouldn't hate them as much as Nico hates them, but they are very expensive for what you get, and there is a lot of perception around them that you're paying for. The algorithm, YouTube, which of the 5 factors do you put the most importance in? I only care about one thing, view duration. YouTube also more or less only cares about that one thing, view duration. This is about how much of the video are people watching. If it's high, then YouTube recommends the video to other people. If you are watching this video and most of you stay for 90% of the video, then YouTube is going to recommend this video to other people. If you click on the thumbnail, you hear my voice and you leave immediately, then YouTube is mainly not going to recommend this watch video to other people. Clickbait doesn't work anymore on YouTube. What you want to do is live up to people's expectations. So the connection between the title, the thumbnail, and the content has to be the same, and the content has to be engaging. If it is that, then people will stay, and that's how you do well on YouTube. End of story. Flex versus stealth wealth. Does this play a role in your decision making? I'm not into flex watches as such. Not that I can afford a full gold Royal Oak offshore, but I wouldn't buy it even if I could. If I'm going gold, I'm going for something understated, so white gold or rose gold, but only the case and then on a strap that doesn't make it for a big old full gold experience. Something, to tone it down. That's also why I like the black dial on this one. It's a little bit more understated. I just think it's just more low-key. In your opinion, what percentage of the population actually cares about watches? Less than 0.1% of the world's population, possibly even less than 0.01%. At least if you're talking about, watch enthusiasts. And I've got some data points. Nico Leonard has, around about 4 million views a month on his channel. Teddy, who has the biggest channel on watches by far, has about 8 million views and 1.3 million subscribers in a month. So 8 million views in a month. Adrian Barker, he gets about 1,900,000 views per month. Britt gets about 1.2 million views in a month. Andrew Morgan gets about 900,000 views in a month. I get about 1 million, 1.2 million views in a month. Marquez Brownlee, who is a tech YouTuber, has 20 million subscribers and gets 62 million views every month. There are 20 or more YouTubers, 30 maybe, that within tech have 5 million or more subscribers that just talk, about Apple products. There's a channel with a guy that makes videos about Lego, where he engineers things with Lego. He has 5 million subscribers and he gets 50 million views every month. I know YouTube isn't the entire watch world, but I think it's a decent reflection of the broader reality that this watch enthusiasm thing is a teeny tiny little itty bitty tiny niche. Do you think we'll see a 37 or 38 millimeter Ingenieur? No, as long as we have a 40 and 36, I don't see them making a 37. That would be redundant. Which watch should I buy? The one you can afford and the one you like the most. Do ADs get to choose the products they sell? That depends on the brand. For Rolex, the answer is sort of. I've spoken to multiple ADs, and the way they explain it is that Rolex has an allocation for a market, one AD, and the AD can apply wishes, but they don't completely get to pick and choose. And I mean, think about it. If you're an AD for Rolex, wouldn't you just call them and say, only send me Daytonas in steel, only send me the white dial, only send me GMTs and Pepsi and Submariners. Don't send us 1908s. Don't send me anything in two-tone. I want none of that nonsense. And don't send me, Datejusts with non-fluted bezels. That's obviously not happening. So what happens is they have a wish list. They can say what they like. And when they restock, they can sort of indicate where they would like it to go. But overall, Rolex figures out entirely what you get. And then that's what shows up. And they don't know what's going to show up. It's like, hey, we got a Daytona this day. And then they can sell that watch. For other brands, you've got more flexibility, and it's all going to depend on the relative power of the brand, the popularity of the product, and the negotiating power of the AD. So for Omega, you have to obviously stock a certain amount of their watches. They're not going to let you just have X watch, the Speedmaster only or whatever, but you'll have more leeway to say, we need more of these because these are popular here, etc., etc., etc. But also, they're also going to not be allowed to say, well, we just want lots of white Speedies. That's going to be a more controlled delivery of watches. How is Longines out-competing the competition in the 2 to 4K price range? I don't know if they're necessarily out-competing. It depends on how you define it. They are in that price range, I think, the biggest game in town, and bigger than, for example, Seiko, who I think have more volume at lower prices. But Tudor, Baumatic, all the independents, nobody moves the volumes that Longines do. So why do they dominate? Well, it's because they've been around for a long time and they've used their historically strong market position to ensure they stay the biggest player in that price point. In that sense, they are out competing. But if I look at the individual products, I don't believe that every single $2,000 to $4,000 watch from Longines is the best of its kind at that price point. I can find Nomos watches I would pick over comparable Longines models. I can find Tudor watches I would pick over Longines models. I can find brands that I think have more interesting movements. I can find brands that have more, better finishing and have some key selling points that in some way are better than some Longines models. Longines aren't by default the best if there's sort of an objective way of defining best in a price point. Considering though that they are the dominant player, I'd say this. They don't rip you off, they don't skimp, they don't misuse their dominant position to cut corners on their products. What you get in an Ultrachron, a Magitech, or a Spirit, or a Zulu Time is entirely competitive and compelling as an offering. Everybody is allowed to disagree, and I'm sure somebody in the comments will have a personal opinion that Longines are not good enough for the price. But my own assessment is that they hit hard with good value, good quality, and a price that matches pretty well. And they do it pretty consistently. How important is the Geneva seal to watches today? Rolex doesn't use it. Patek Philippe has their own mark. Is it worth looking for the seal among forgotten pieces from Chopard, Vacheron, and other makers dipping under $10,000? I'm not going to advise on historic models. It's not my niche. I barely take an interest in it for all sorts of reasons. But a couple of perspectives. I'm first going to ask you a question. If I'm trying to sell you milk and I say it's safe to drink, do you trust me? That's one question. Second question, if I want to sell you milk and I say that this milk is certified safe by the United States government, the United Nations, the World Health Organization, and the EU, would you trust that more than me just saying that it's safe? So if we park the sort of troll comments of the you can't trust the government and the EU is bad and the United Nations is something, 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 and there was no moon landing, then okay, fine. Let's just park that. Then the only correct answer is the external governmental certification should instill you with more trust. Me, as an individual, I can make stuff up and lie and you can't verify it. Not unless you have your own little testing lab in your basement, but the government can. Now, the Geneva seal isn't a governmental certification, but it is and was a form of external validation to ensure that this was a good watch. Patek decided not to use the Geneva seal. I don't remember the reasons, but I think you do that when you either think that the certification isn't useful to you or that you think that you are so good that you are trusting yourself that you will make a certification for yourself that people will trust more than the official external certification. So that's one perspective. Second perspective, when brands pull out of the certification, it also devalues the value of the certification. The fact is that certification doesn't exist in isolation. Its credibility is also a product of who uses it and applies it. So think for a moment, you have a Chinese factory brand, make a $200 watch, and they are magically able to get a METAS certification. Initially, I think you would be impressed. You were like, whoa, this Chinese brand, they are making a $200 watch that's METAS certified. But what happens next? At some point, you're like, if a $200 watch can get a METAS certification, How impressive is Metas really? Then there's the third perspective. When you look at a Vacheron Constantin with a Geneva seal and some watch in the same price point that doesn't, can an expert see the difference? And can you see the difference? Experts might be able to, but can you? The answer boils down to those three perspectives. Make up your own mind. What, in your opinion, is an acceptable percentage of your net worth to spend on watches? Only what you can afford without causing financial harm in the short, medium, or long term for yourself or those that depend on you. What is the best watch ever made? There's no such thing. The most popular one is probably the Casio F91. The implementation of stiff US tariffs against Switzerland, do you think the Swiss-made label could go from being a positive to a negative and perhaps open the doors to quality watch companies made in countries with lower tariffs? No. Swiss-made stands on the actual quality of the products with that term on the dial. That's what defines whether or not Swiss-made has a value. For now, and from what I hear from people I talk to in the industry, Swiss-made is still an incredible selling point. But me, as a watch nerd, personally, I couldn't care less. Glashütte Original, Lange & Söhne, Nomos, they're not Swiss, and I don't question their quality for a second either. I don't question Zinn's quality. I don't question Grand Seiko's quality. And they're definitely not Swiss. But I'm a watch nerd, and I'm not a regular consumer. For me, we're at a point where Swiss-made has very little brand value to me. I don't think tariffs are what is going to do it, but the nature of this globalized world where we live in and the democratization of production processes means that more brands from other places than Switzerland are capable of making really impressive timepieces. Over time, that equalization will potentially lead to the concept of Swiss-made being less impressive. But it's not because of tariffs. It's because things can be built at a very high quality somewhere else. What are the chances of Omega releasing a sub 14mm GMT? If you had asked me 3 months ago, I would have said not high. But then they released the Planet Ocean, which is almost 3mm thinner than the old model, and it's like 13.5mm. And that's for a 600-meter water resistance dive watch. It's still a thick watch, but it's got no transparent case back. It's got a titanium case back and some other things that have allowed them to thin the Planet Ocean down. And it tells me that it's possible. And it tells me that I think the world timer from Omega is, it's just a smidge over 14mm. If they do something similar to that as they did to the Planet Ocean, then they can get it under 14mm. And from there, a GMT is entirely doable. And the Planet Ocean shows that it's something that they are actively considering doing. Are anti-magnetic silicone hairsprings more a must-have, or are they overrated? Okay. Breitling developed their own specific lubricant for the jewels that they use in their movements. Is that a must-have or is it overrated? I don't know. I think it's good. Watches are weird because they are just jewelry, and no matter how high-tech they are nowhere near as accurate as quartz watches or an Apple Watch or your phone. But manufacturers still pump a lot of R&D into making more accurate, more precise, more robust, more anti-magnetic watches with longer power reserves and all sorts of other stuff. Anti-magnetic hairsprings in whatever material are preferable to ones that can be magnetized. Using a material that also doesn't lose its tension so the amplitude is stable over longer time is also preferable. Is it strictly necessary for jewelry? No. For me, the appeal of the development and the in-houseness of new Dynapulse escapements are not necessarily just down to the technical, theoretical, or practical benefits of whatever the innovation is. For me, it's an indication that you have a brand that cares and isn't half-assing it. There's a value to me that a brand is pushing the envelope in terms of innovation. It's like a Bugatti Chiron, which is an expensive car for all sorts of reasons. Obviously I'll never own one, but would I even ever drive it at 400 kilometers an hour? No. But there's value to them doing that effort. I also don't need 200 hours of power reserve beating at 5 hertz, but I would respect that someone put the work into figuring out how to do it. Do you think Rolex's success is attributed to their private ownership with no threat of shareholders affecting business decisions? In part, yes. The reason In-N-Out Burger is so much better than McDonald's is in part because of how the owners have stayed true to their original vision, and that is in part the ownership model that has allowed them to do that. The same goes for Rolex. Companies that work these days and are on the stock market are short-term in nature. Rolex can think long-term. You never talk about vintage. or even consider it in your videos that I've seen. Why? I don't like scratches that have been made by other people. I want to make my own scratches, and that's kind of all the way. The only used or sort of vintage watches I have are ones that belong to my father, and that's the only ones I care about. I want to make my own scratches on everything else. Whew, that's it. I'm spent. I hope you enjoyed the video. A lot of questions. Thanks so much for submitting them. It's really appreciated that you're so engaged in my little community. Share your comments. Stay classy. Like, subscribe. Cheers.